Starting our list with the Chevy Camaro. No 70s muscle car conversation is complete without the discussion of this monster. Already by 1970, the Camaro second generation had undergone its styling change to become longer, lower, and wider, and appeared more aggressive. Because of the distinctive egg crate grille reminiscent of Ferrari, that front end and four round taillights visible from a distance of a mile distinguished 70 to 73 models. Well, you're probably wondering what makes this Camaro famous. Oh, if you care about the performance, then you cannot overlook the Z28, particularly the 1971. This version had the 350 Ci LT1 engine, solid lifters, and with 360 horsepower and 415 pound-feet of torque, this car became unbeatable. In its best setup, it could achieve a quarter-mile time of 14.3 seconds at 102 miles per hour. Yes, it may not have had the raw power to muscle its way through its rivals as some of the other Camaro designs, but it had the spirit that drivers loved on the street and track. For Camaro enthusiasts, the second-generation cars are favored because they are the next progressive step up from the first generation, and still eye candy for the people that see them as the ultimate muscle cars with class. Now, speaking of iconic designs, let's talk about the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. If you were a fan of Smokey and the Bandit or the Rockford Files, you already know this car's impact on pop culture. But let's not forget the Firebird's more serious side. This car was no joke. Built on GM's F-body platform, which it shared with the Camaro, the Firebird was Pontiac's answer to the muscle car era, and its Trans Am trim was the performance king. Ever wonder what really made the Trans Am stand out in the 1970s? Was it the Screaming Eagle, or something much more subtle? In 1970, Pontiac introduced the Trans Am with the 400 Ci Ram Air 3 engine, and by the mid-70s, it had ramped things up even more with the famous 455 Ci V8 that produced 335 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. With the bold Screaming Eagle logo on the hood and the aggressive styling, the Trans Am wasn't just a muscle car, it was a statement. But beyond the showiness, the Firebird and its top-end models had serious performance chops, especially when you consider its presence in motorsport. This was a car that looked like it could do it all, and in many ways, it did. With a quarter-mile time of around 14 seconds and a top speed of 118 miles per hour, it had both flair and muscle. Production numbers for this iconic generation crossed 480,000 units. Hence, it's still quite popular among enthusiasts. Moving on to the next car, if you're talking raw power, there's one name that comes to mind, the Chevelle SS454. And for muscle car enthusiasts, the 70 Chevelle SS454 was the top of the line during the earlier 1970s. Some of the models had a monstrous 454 cubic inch big block V8 engine that generated a whopping 450 horsepower and 500 pound-foot of torque. Not only was the Chevelle SS454 a fast car, but it was also an aggressive car that ruled the streets and the Strip. But here's the twist that might shock you. One of the most iconic muscle cars of the 70s almost didn't make it into production. The 1970 Chevelle SS454 with its 450 horsepower engine was originally set to be canceled by GM due to concerns over rising fuel prices and tightening emission standards. That's right, this monstrous machine, a symbol of raw American power, was nearly scrapped. In fact, GM had to fight tooth and nail to keep it alive, with engineers lobbying to ensure it stayed in production. Imagine if the muscle car era had ended just a few years earlier. We might not have had these unforgettable machines to admire today. Even after the 70s, the Chevelle SS454 continued to be a symbol of muscle cars, and though the 1971 model witnessed a power cut, it still surged up to 425 horsepower from its LS6 engine. It could sprint the quarter mile in 13.7 seconds at a blistering 103 miles per hour. Only around 20,000 units were produced, making it relatively rare. The muscle car is not only about high power and influential speed, it's also about elegance and performance. The Chevelle SS 454. Those are the lights, the posture, the front bumper, and that glorious air intake. Not to mention the sound of the engine when driving. Every reason why the Chevelle SS 454 is rated as one of the most attractive sports cars on the market ever. Now let's switch gears for a second. Literally, the AMC Javelin might not be as well known as some of the other heavy hitters on this list, but that's exactly what makes it stand out. AMC, the underdog, was fighting against the likes of Chevy, Ford, and Pontiac. But the Javelin was a formidable competitor in its own right. Introduced in 1971, the Javelin was AMC's answer to the pony car wars. It wasn't just about looks, either. This thing could perform. The 401 cubic inch V8 engine made 330 horsepower, 430 pound-feet of torque, and thanks to its lightweight design, it was fast and agile, especially in the Trans Am Racing Series. This allowed it to clock a quarter mile in 14.3 seconds and reach a top speed of 112 miles per hour. Though the Javelin didn't have the same reputation as the muscle car giants, it was a car that held its own, offering a unique and underappreciated alternative in a sea of mainstream muscle. Production numbers hovered around 250,000 units, making it a rare sight on roads today. Next up is the Ford Mustang Big Horse. When 1971 came along, Ford's Mustang had matured. All right, more like ballooned. The small, maneuverable pony car of the 60s had become a much larger, more muscular Big Horse. But could the Big Horse Mustang actually outrun the classic 60s Mustang? And what secret modifications did Ford make to keep it competitive? The name might sound rather senseless, but it's actually quite apt for this Mustang for this period of time. These Stangs began to expand in size, weight, and creature comforts to become more similar to bona fide full-size muscle cars with stout hearts that beat in the 71 to 73 model lines. These are the last of the first-generation Mustangs, up to the point that the car got some serious redesign applied. But do not be deceived by its size, because the Big Horse still pumped out power. The 1971 Mustang Super Cobra Jet had a 429 cubic inch V8, and it produced 375 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. It could sprint the quarter mile in 13.7 seconds at a blistering 103 miles per hour. Yes, it wasn't the athletic pony car of old, but it lacked nothing for sheer drag and dominance on the asphalt. The Big Horse Mustang was one of the dominant horses of the times. Only around 20,000 units were produced, making it relatively rare. Next on our list is the Ford Torino. While many muscle cars from the 70s were becoming more refined and polished, the Ford Torino was still going strong. The 1972 Torino may not have had the monster engines that defined the early part of the decade, but it had something just as special: style. The 72 Torino had one of the most aggressive and sleek front ends of the era, with a grille that looked like something straight out of a fighter jet, giving it a truly unique look. Performance-wise, the top engine you could get was the 351 cubic inch V8, which produced 370 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque, which wasn't exactly a monster by the standards of earlier models, but still delivered decent power for the time. It could do the quarter mile in 14.1 seconds and reach a top speed of 120 miles per hour. While the Torino might not have been the ultimate muscle car of the decade, it was a favorite for anyone who wanted something that was both fast and gorgeous. Production numbers for the 72 Torino topped 500,000 units. Its role as the base for NASCAR racing cars and its cameo in Clint Eastwood's movie Gran Torino added to its allure. Now, the Plymouth Cuda was one of the last purebred muscle cars before the trend started changing. But how did the gas crisis really affect the Plymouth Cuda's power? And is it true that the 1974 model was its final swan song? Launched in 1970, the Cuda's stunning lines and raw power ensured it was one of the most sought-after cars in America. However, by the 1974 model year, the Cuda began to struggle due to the gas crisis and with the new stricter emission control laws. Nevertheless, Plymouth was able to pull out some performance before it would be married off to obscurity. The 1974 model lacked the aggressiveness of the Cuda designs before it, but it had the feel of the previous models. The car had a 440 cubic inch engine that delivered 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. Though one was always aware that it was never a muscle car powerhouse, but still the Cuda was always flashy and attractive to look at. It completed the quarter mile in just 13.5 seconds, reaching speeds of up to 110 miles per hour. Production numbers were low, with only 11,000 Hemi Cudas ever built, making them highly coveted today. Moving on to our next car. The Chevy Laguna S3 was Chevy's attempt to stay relevant in the muscle car market after the golden years had passed. This car was far from the fire-breathing beasts of the earlier part of the decade, but it offered a unique combination of style and capability. The Laguna S3 was more refined, with a focus on aerodynamics and a sleeker design. The Chevrolet Laguna S3 featured a 454 cubic inch V8 engine with 245 horsepower and 375 pound-feet of torque, offering a more restrained but still capable performance. It had a quarter-mile time of 16.3 seconds and a top speed of 110 miles per hour. While the power wasn't anywhere near what it had been in the earlier muscle cars, the Laguna S3 made up for it with its handling and sleek looks, especially when it got its slant-nose front end and unique design features in the mid-70s. Chevrolet produced 110,000 units of the Laguna S3 during its run. That's it for this one. Now, how about the 1978 Ford? All in all, muscle cars were already on their death throes by 1978. The performance scene had toned down, and now in trend were more realistic and efficient cars, like the Ford Fairmont. But here's the thing, the Fairmont really wasn't about muscle in the traditional sense of the word. It was more about potential. The Ford Fairmont looked like a mild-mannered sedan, but could be fitted with a 302 Windsor V8 engine, making it a surprising sleeper car. With 210 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque, it managed a quarter mile in 15.2 seconds and topped out at 110 miles per hour. Over 500,000 units of the Fairmont were produced. During the 1970s malaise era, the Ford Fairmont had a number of advantages. It was a light car that had the possibility of becoming a truly great make in the right hands. It wasn't a muscle car by 1978 standards, yet it could become a sleeper car like the Mustang would in its fox body form in the later years. It may not have sounded great in the 1970s, but it rolled the foundation for the muscle cars in the 1980s. Now, moving to the final car on the list, the Chevy Malibu of 1978 wasn't the powerhouse its predecessors were. By the late 70s, muscle cars were taking a back seat to efficiency and economy. However, the Malibu's combination of great looks, comfort, and just enough horsepower to keep enthusiasts happy made it a decent option for people still looking for a car with a bit of an attitude. The 1978 Chevrolet Malibu marked a shift towards smaller, more efficient muscle cars. Yet it still offered a punch with its optional 350 cubic inch V8 engine, producing 175 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque. It had a quarter-mile time of 17 seconds and a top speed of 105 miles per hour. Chevrolet built over 800,000 units, making it one of the best-selling cars of all time. The Malibu's V8 engine wasn't going to win any races, but in the context of the times, it still held a place in the hearts of enthusiasts. as a reminder of what the muscle car era had once been. The 1970s were a fascinating time for muscle cars. They represented the peak and the decline of an era in American automotive history. While these cars were still impressive in their own right, the golden age of muscle was drawing to a close. Emissions regulations, fuel crises, and changing consumer preferences all played a role in shaping the cars of the 70s. But for those who experienced it, these cars were the last of their kind. They represented a time when power was king, and driving wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about feeling the raw energy coursing through your veins as you slammed the pedal to the metal. The muscle cars of the 70s, whether it was the aggressive Camaro, the iconic Firebird Trans Am, or the powerful Chevelle SS454, will always be remembered as the final roars of a performance era that would soon come to an end.